Welcome back, everyone, to Coffeehouse Blunders Season 2, the Queen's Gambit edition. I'm James Montemagno. I'm a program manager by day, chess aficionado by night, and additionally, sometimes I'm Batman. Yes, and with me, my best friend in the entire world, international master and chief chess officer or chief content officer, however you want to say it, of chess.com, Daniel Rensch. How's it going, buddy?
Going good, man. That was a very fast and furious start. I liked it. You sounded like a DJ from like a small town in like Sandusky, Ohio or something. Like, welcome back. I mean, you hit it hard. I love it. Let's do it.
Ricker. Welcome back, everyone, to Coffeehouse Blunders, the one and only podcast you need to break down the Queen's Gambit international sensation. I figure we get into it. We are episode 4. If you haven't been following along yet, season 2 of Coffeehouse Blunders, Danny and I have been breaking down every single episode of the Queen's Gambit with no spoilers of future episodes, which is important because I have not finished Queen's Gambit because I stopped when we started recording this podcast, so I can live it side by side, the deep, intense analysis that Danny gives of every single game. And I bring in a unique perspective of I'm not an international master or national master or really a good chess player at all. So
I was just waiting to see where that went. That was awesome. But you said you're watching in real time, which makes it really special. This episode here, Middle Game, is the first official episode that you had not seen until after we started the podcast.
That's correct. Yeah. And I watched it twice yesterday. So my wife and I sat down, we watched it normal. I only bugged her once or twice. I was like, can I please rewind it 15 seconds just so I can get the notes? I was taking notes while we were watching it, but I left a big gap so I could rewatch it. And I wrote down some key things. I was like, I'm going to fact check that. I'm going to, you know me on this podcast.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Like, what year was that TV made? What airplane was that? This episode, I didn't get that much. I only have 1 or 2 fun facts for us, but this will say things got real on this episode, and not only in chess, but in life, and is sad. Like I walked away sad on so many levels about everything. And my wife was like, I knew that was going to happen. Like, no big deal. We'll get to it. But I was just like, man, so sad. The whole thing.
Interesting. I can't wait to hear. Okay, you've got notes, and I also watched it again yesterday, also with my wife, and also hilariously, this was the first episode, or let's say last episode, which is why I almost just combined the words first and last with fast. No, but this was the fast episode Shauna had seen, meaning when I was first sort of given the task by the team at chess.com, like, hey man, this thing's blowing up. We're going to do tons of breakdown videos. We need you to binge the show. I started it on a weekend, and she made it to this episode with me. So she's now seen the first 4 episodes twice as well. And she hasn't seen episodes 5, 6, and 7. So she left the episode yesterday also saying the same thing. Like, now I remember why I didn't want to keep watching this show. It's so sad. What are we doing here? Right. So I'm like, don't worry. Now that we're doing the podcast, we're going to watch 5, 6, and 7. It does pick up again. You're not going to be sad the whole time. So it's funny. She had the same feeling Shauna did after last night watching it.
And I'll say this, when we were watching it yesterday, Heather, my wife, she stopped me many a times, like 3 or 4 times throughout the episode, and asked me questions. She's like, did you and Danny discuss this? Did you and Danny discuss this? Because she now knows that sort of, I've been telling her, like, as we've been going on walks, I've been breaking down the first 3 episodes, all these different things. And it was great because getting her perspective gives me additional questions to ask you. Cause I was like, oh yeah, we did discuss that, but we didn't get that far because it didn't happen. Right. We didn't have a adjourning of a game ever. Like, I've never experienced that. And that happened in this episode. And she's like, well, how does it actually work? And I'm like, I'm about to find out tomorrow.
We're going to find out. I thought you were going to first tell me that story and be like, well, obviously I responded with my wife. Why aren't you listening to the podcast? And then you would know what we've discussed. No, kidding.
That's true. I don't know if she wants to put up with my voice for that much longer.
Hey, my wife, same thing. She made a comment about that this morning, which is neither here nor there. Let's continue. So
now, that being said, we open up in a very fascinating part because, Beth Harmon, she wanted to learn Russian. She's mentioned it before. She's in Russian school, and you were in Russia for a long time, correct?
And my first note is Danny spent a lot of time in Russia, and I actually still speak Russian. I am not as fluent as I once was, and I won't say that I was ever I was never like fully fluent. I think if you got that far, it would, you could never lose it. But I've been to Russia a few times, but the time I spent the most there was the summer of 2002. So I was 16 because I turned 17 that October. That's right. So I by the end, like you cross the line of a language, Mots, when you start thinking in that language.
Yeah.
So that's how I knew. I was there for 2 full months plus, and like not only was I reading it like street signs and stuff, but I was also like when I was thinking about the chess moves, I played in several tournaments, and it's actually where I got my first international master norm. So for those of you who maybe somehow haven't listened to our first 3 podcasts, back up and listen to the 3rd episode where I give kind of a detailed breakdown of what it is to actually become a titled chess player and earn what's called a performance norm. But that's at 16, that's where I earned my first international master norm, even though I didn't get the IM title until several years later. And I was thinking in Russian. I was like, and I was remembering that, kind of reminiscing about it with Shauna, because I also took Russian classes. I had a private Russian tutor. Read a lot of Russian history, and I was fascinated by it, by the Bolshevik Party and all things that grew into Trotsky and eventually Stalin, and understanding the entire rise and fall of the Soviet Union. So for Americans, I do know a lot about Russian history, more than probably most, and yeah, I did speak Russian and spent a lot of time there.
Yeah, and when you're fully immersed, it's completely different than learning in class, because Heather is a Spanish major, but she also studied abroad in Spain and in Argentina. And whenever we travel, it takes a little bit to get back up, but we were in Valencia, and that's where she studied abroad, and she was with some of her friends. And you could just tell maybe after a half an hour of just everyone speaking Spanish, she was like right back in it 100%. And I'm just like enjoying it because I think it's always fascinating. I have no idea what's being said because I just know one language, but that's really cool. And where in Russia did you stay? Moscow?
So Moscow, for the most part, Moskva. I did go to St. Petersburg, Leningrad for the White Knights tournament, which is a famous tournament because it's during a time of the year where it never gets dark. It's twilight, basically. And even in Moscow, I mean, I remember the sun was setting post 10 p.m. and up at 3, and I didn't. It took me a while to get back on a sleep schedule after being there for so long. Not just visiting for a tournament. But yeah, the White Knights is a famous tournament during twilight, and a lot of other things take place in those nights besides just chess, because people never sleep. But yeah, it's a famous tournament. And but other than that, I didn't really travel more than just kind of the greater Moscow metropolitan area.
Gotcha. Very cool. That's awesome. I've never been to Russia. I've had a few friends that have traveled through. I love to travel. It's Heather and I were talking about how it's actually kind of sad. I used to travel, like you did. Like, I was on the road 80% of the year, and now this year it's been none. So it's fascinating. I'm excited to get a few shots in my arm and then head back on the road at some point in the next year or two. But yeah, it's definitely on my list to go travel because I think it's just very fascinating. And yeah, Beth is in school learning Russian, and this episode to me, there's an arching theme here, which is I'm not the director, right, of this, but this episode starts to highly sexualize Beth Harmon in first a more discreet way. So she's in class learning Russian. There's this dude. I'm not impressed by this dude, by the way. He looks like a schmuck, but he kind of does. I don't know.
Right. That's good.
And he invites her over. One, I love this sort of hippie wallpaper whole setup they got going on, guitars on the wall, and they're all smoking and having fun. So she's like maturing a little bit, and she's still actually 17. I got it wrong. I thought she was 18, but she hasn't turned 18
I
yet.
made a note of that things in this episode are probably not legal, although in the 60s it wasn't necessarily the same as it is nowadays, I guess.
Yeah, the smoking of the era, though now it's even more legal than ever, technically. Right. So to smoke weed. So, but I think that fascinatingly, when we look back at the previous episode with Towns, it actually makes Towns even more creepier. Because we thought that she was 18 and she's not, and then it gets really weird because she's still 17 throughout this entire episode, and so in the opening scene with this dude. I think that Beth has boys on her mind. So she's maturing. Her body's maturing. We've seen this go on. We cannot we cannot step into the shoes of a 17-year-old female. It's impossible, right? So we can't really speak to Beth Harmon.
Right.
But I will say this, especially later in the episode, they start to do a lot more like sexualization of Beth for no reason. Like I understand here where she's in this dude's home, she's got like, on the mind, some sex on the mind,
She
and
lights the candle, but we won't talk about.
this big penis candle.
Yeah,
And it is. It's what it is. It's what it is. Okay. If
Yep,
we can only be as family friendly as the
as
show,
we
there's a
can.
big,
Yep.
big. This is not a candle I would purchase personally.
Right. Right.
I don't know why you would purchase this
Especially as a
candle.
guy. Yeah, yeah. No, it's a big although in the 60s, the free love kind of movement and hippies,
Yep.
it was like, sometimes in life, and if we look back at our culture, you can't start the swinging of a pendulum and ever expect it goes calmly back to the middle. That's just something
Mhm.
that's just true about life and all things, right? So once a pendulum has been grabbed, it's been pulled to a side, it's going to swing violently for a while until it finds balance. And this is something that we know that generation. I mean, speaking to my parents and the baby boomers or whatever you want to call it, I mean, there was a
Mhm.
movement to sort of rebel against not just organized religion, so to speak, but against the thought of traditional sort of like sexuality, what was okay, what wasn't okay. I mean, you're literally in a scene, like you said, we can only be as clean as the episode. They're borderline in like an orgy room, right? I mean, like
Yeah.
it doesn't go that direction, right? Obviously, she has whatever experience she has there with this, the schmuck as you called him. But yeah, right. I mean, that's obviously a direct sort of just reference to what was going on at the time and what young people were doing as far as. And if you think about it, I mean, think about who her stepmother, or sorry, not stepmother, adopted mother was, right? You're talking about a more traditional woman who married into a relationship that we don't know what they were like when they were younger, but clearly at the time Beth Harmon came to their life in episode 2, you're not talking about a woman who's happily and thriving in her marriage, right? We would not
Yeah.
disagree with that.
I would
And
agree
and
with that. Yeah.
and so, but the traditional roles were that there was no place for a woman to like find herself outside of a marriage for the most part. Divorces, at least initiated by a woman, were exceedingly rare at the time, almost non-existent, right? It was like sort of be seen and not heard to a degree, despite how miserable you are. And then there was a generation that came up after them that rebelled, aggressively against the sort of traditional way that couples were there. So sort of we'll just call it free love and different sexual partners was a part of the time, right? And part of what they were doing to find balance and what you would argue was maybe previously in the pendulum, maybe too extreme the other way, right? In terms of traditional views and what was okay and wasn't okay. So I just kind of look at it like that. And I look at the 60s as kind of an era that, you just look at the way generations go. And that was kind of what was going on. There's a lot of stuff like that. So, you know,
And there were
penis candle or not, it maybe you didn't have a penis candle, James, but people had penis candles back then. Okay.
penis candles and waterbeds
And
Danny.
waterbeds.
There was I had to
And
rewatch it.
wallpaper,
And
yeah.
I was like, what is that noise? So in this scene, Beth, we assume loses her virginity to this schmuck,
Right. Right.
and which is a hilarious scene because they're both high, and she's like, "How
Right.
much longer?" She's like, "How much
Yeah.
longer?"
It's super awkward and
super awkward, just like as one's first time is.
everyone's first time is awkward. Maybe not exactly waterbed, both sides
No.
are high awkward, but you get it.
I've never had a waterbed, but I imagine even sleeping in a waterbed has to be awkward. I don't understand waterbeds in general. If you own a waterbed, anyone listening, please write into the show, and we would love that feedback on said waterbed.
Right. We'd like to get as detailed
sleep.
as possible at what different experiences, both sleeping and otherwise, are like on waterbeds. Just kidding.
Yes. So that whole scene transpired. And I love the next scene because I actually had this written down. She wakes up, she's by herself, alone in this house, and there's a note and are we calling it a joint, a doobie, a pre-roll, if you will, was waiting for her there on the fridge. And they said, we're going to go see a movie in Cincinnati. And I was like, that's got to be far away. I was like, how far away is Cincinnati? And it's 1.5 hours. So that is quite a long distance to go see a movie, but maybe there were no movie theaters in Lexington, Kentucky in 66. But yeah, it was a great scene. And I actually missed my favorite part of the scene, which is she called her mom.
Yeah.
And her mom, I wrote it down. She goes, she's like, are you with a boy or whatever? And then she goes, be careful of what you smoke.
Mm-hmm. I love
it. It was just like her mom knows. Her mom knows
Yeah.
what's up. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it was it was fantastical. So it was a fascinating scene. I thought that they characterized, this experience fairly well. It wasn't overly sexualized. I mean,
Yep.
it was and it wasn't at the
There was
same
no
time.
nudity. There was no nudity. There was no, and that's kind of an overarching theme of what the writing and I'll say directing of the show has been about and continues to be is
Hmm.
you can say things without saying them. You can say things
Hmm.
with looks. You can describe and imply without being overtly direct, right? I mean, I think there's a lot of things left to you reaching a conclusion in a lot of both characters and just kind of the premise of the show, right? So that's kind of what they did. There's not they don't need to go over the top and get graphic to imply what goes on. And I only want to add one more thing before we move on from the speaking Russian topic in our schmuck, because I made a note of that, not just my experience, speaking Russian and spending time in Russia, but also that, again, it was a direct sort of reference to Beth Harmon's character being sort of based around Bobby Fischer, because for those who don't know, Bobby Fischer also learned Russian, and it was well documented that he wanted to speak Russian because he was confident that the Russians and the Soviets were talking about him and cheating at tournaments because they could tell each other things that, obviously him being the outside American would not understand. So, and then later on in this episode, we know we have the elevator scene, which we'll get
Yeah.
into in terms of things said about Beth Harmon. So I just, for the, doing my job, bringing the chess references and what fictional / factual storylines are we following? That was, again, another thing that could be very comparable to how Americans felt during the battle against the Soviet Union in the Cold War chess days. So anyway, sorry, now we can move
Gotcha.
forward.
Oh, and I will say one more thing on this entire like learning Russian, the schmuck that I'm going to call it, to have no name.
Yeah.
He said he wanted to learn Russian because he wanted to read the original Dostoevsky
Yeah, yeah.
in Russian. I didn't know who that author was, and then I looked said person up on Wikipedia, and that's the author of Crime and Punishment and a bunch of other novels. But this would be like the one thing where a lot of times in Heather and I were discussing this when you're watching television, right, and movies, they have a lot of facts. Like even Heather, she was saying up until a point, we didn't actually know if Beth was in America or still in Paris. Like for a little bit of time until she got adopted, you'd really have to pay attention to, um, the newspaper or whatever, and that flashes really quick in front of you, or some of the dialogue that
Right,
they say.
right.
So you kind of have to pay attention to some of that where this character references this author. I'm like, I don't know who that author is. Or I don't know. I don't read books,
Yeah, I'd be,
and that fascinating.
sorry, I was laughing about the I don't read books thing. Yeah, when I first heard, I quickly my brain was wrapped up in their discussion about communism and capitalism, and I
Hmm.
realized I admit the
Monopoly.
first yeah Monopoly, and the first time through, I admit I was like I kind of didn't care who the author was because I was like they're probably just talking about Communist Manifesto or Karl Marx or something. But no, you're right. That was a good look up. A little more subtle than that, but obviously again, you've got this random American schmuck, right, learning Russian during that time as another way to rebel against the capitalistic, oppressive American culture, right, in his eyes. So
Hmm.
there you go.
Yeah.
All good, all good. Hippie love, let's go.
And I love that they left her alone, and then she just embraced that, by the way. And
Yeah,
again, one of my favorite scenes is Beth in her element, exploring freedom, what it means to kind of be alone in your house, doing whatever you want. She's like drinking tons, dancing tons, just like being herself. And that was a cool sort of inside view of how Beth's mind is working in this time as a 17-year-old going
right.
on, like exploring some freedom again, talking to the era where freedom and expressing yourself was at a forefront. So I thought that was
Right.
kind of cool in
Yep.
general. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, and it's something we didn't talk much about. We'll get into it more in this episode, given where it goes. But in our last breakdown, there was a lot of chess, and we talked a lot about the travel and your undiscovered nuggets of flight patterns in during the during the 60s in the U.S. But it was also one of the things that happened in that episode was the first time that her mother had openly offered her an alcoholic beverage, if you remember, when they were in the
Yes.
hotel room and in episode 3, and she kind of said, hey, you want a beer, right? And then in this episode that kind of goes full-fledged. She's really pushing those rebellious boundaries, which I don't even know if like drinking alcohol itself then was as frowned upon for those underage as it is now, but also it doesn't mean it wasn't illegal. It was, and also to that level of alcohol consumption was just early signs that the way they do a good job of describing Beth's character, like she's a genius and she's troubled, right? She's got anger issues. She's got issues. Who wouldn't, given where she's been from, right? And so sometimes when she lets it all out, the inner, the unsettled inner kind of hurt child or rebellious person in her wants to binge and see what her limits are and really express herself with, drinking and dancing and just see where things go.
And then she graduated high school. It's all done. She's done. Yay.
Yeah.
And that was cool. I love Beth's mom in this scene because she's like the only one clapping. So excited. And then it's over. But we get through, we start to get closer to chess. There's a little bit less chess, but more exciting chess in a weird way the second time I watched it. But I did need to ask you. So we learned that there's like 3 big matches, Mexico City, something else. And then they're going to Paris.
The U.S. Championship, she mentions.
U.S. Championship, and then they're going to Paris for the Remy Vallon. What is this?
So, as far as I know, that name is actually made up. I didn't actually look that up, but
Danny's got to Google. Please hold everybody.
It's so funny as you start to type it. There's so many. The Google autocompletes based on like the Queen's Gambit are just hilarious, right? Because so many people are like looking into this stuff right now. But I'll put it this way: what I took out of it as most relevant is every one of those landmark cities were indeed homes of elite and regular chess events, right?
Yeah.
So that name is not a name of a famous chess tournament, and I could have just said that, but I was Googling here to make sure I was right. I'm pretty sure I'm right. But Paris was home regularly to elite events, as was Mexico City, and as was Moscow. And so they definitely nail like the landmark cities, and that's kind of what I took out of it. She mentions the U.S. Championship, which is important because that's pretty much the whole subject of our next episode. We'll get into it, episode 5 when it's there. But yeah, so I mean, as far as like just getting the landmarks correct, the city, I'm going to read here as you respond to that, but I'm pretty sure that there was no name actually, what you even said there, because I know chess databases and there was no event with players playing from that name.
Yeah, it was a fascinating scene because we do learn right now that she's about to go to 2 international tournaments, right? Which I think is very impressive. 17 years old, going to Mexico City for the international. But then it's also fascinating because Ms. Wheatley gets really excited for Paris, but not so excited for Mexico City, even though we learn that she's about to be really excited. But like, I know that Mexico is the south of our border, right? And it's not that far, but it's also very far from Lexington, Kentucky. Like when I grew up in Ohio, I could never imagine going to Mexico. It's like so far away. And they probably travel a similar distance. It's a little bit shorter to go to Mexico City than it is to Paris, but it's not that much different of a flight, to be honest with you, because it's very far away to some extent. But I thought it was fascinating because she's been talking about international travel, and like Mexico City is international, right? It's an international tournament. So I thought that was cool.
And I felt like maybe that was a weird way they set up too. I have a couple, not issues. I don't have the right to have issues, but there were a couple of things about like the way they handled like the mom's sort of like character in the episode that were a little questioning to me. Yeah, like you would think the butterflies would have hit when she mentions Mexico City based on what ends up happening with their trip to Mexico City and her long lost kind of pen pal lover, right? And so Manuel. So yeah, it was just odd there, right? And then the way the character develops later on, we won't spoiler this podcast. We'll get to it, but that I agree with you. That was odd. I think you could also argue that Paris is a sexy city, right?
Yep.
I've never been to Paris. One of the European cities I've never been to. I know it's amazing, but we know what Paris represents in regards to like just the way people talk about Paris, right?
Paris, the lover city.
Paris, the lover city. So I guess we can give it a pass on that. But yeah, it does get surprising the fact that they right after the scene they hop on a plane, they're headed to Mexico City, and I'll let you take it from there in terms of the bombshell that the mom drops about Manuel.
Yeah, well, I will say this is they get on a plane. And it looks, you don't get to see any details about the plane because I like to investigate a plane, Danny.
Yeah, I know how you investigate planes.
It looks like a very small jet, by the way, which would make no sense going from Lexington, Kentucky all the way down to Mexico unless this was a stopover. But then it was also weird because it looked like a smaller jet and they only showed it from behind. but it was a 3x3 seater, which wouldn't make any sense for a smaller jet, which would be a 2x2 seater. But the whole idea doesn't make any sense. So I'm a little bit confused there. But yeah, she tells Beth that she's had this long pen pal Manuel that she's written back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and he's gonna pick him up from the airport randomly. Never met this dude, but totally gonna do it. And whatever, that's fine. It's fascinating. But on the plane, right? We one continue to see more alcohol consumption throughout the entire episode, which leads up
Yep.
to some tragedy
Later on.
but later on. But yeah, Manuel's there, long lost pen pal, never have met, and at some point, as Mrs. Wheatley gives Beth this really nice watch, the Belova, and it's a very expensive watch. Like today's, it'd be a few $100s, which is not a cheap watch. And I think my overarching theme of this episode, up to a point, which was I really felt that the bond between Mrs. Wheatley and Beth was really strong. Like even in these scenes, like Beth is she's still annoyed at some point about it, but there's some strengths, like, she engraved this watch and it was really, really nice. Like, her mom really wants to like watch more chess, has really been getting more involved in it. And there's some scenes later where Mrs. Wheatley's playing the piano and just like Beth's like really like, connected. I felt really connected to her. And then it was a kind of a weird scene. And they're in Mexico City, whatever. It doesn't matter at this point.
I mean, I agree. And again, I said how Shauna felt after the episode based on the tragedy we're getting to, but I'll just say, like, of all the episodes in the show, I mean, we're breaking this down. We're big fans, all that. I guess we're allowed to be critics. Like this episode was my least favorite. I'll say that. And I'm going to say that again, not spoiling for you, but in an encouraging way. Episodes 5, 6, and 7 really won me back. Like I was very happy with where the show went and the ultimate kind of like, whatever the experiences we get. So I'm not going to say any more than that, but I just want to say, like, of the first 3 and then the 4th whatever episode, right? Being middle game, it was just, I agree. Like I didn't really like how it ended. We'll get to, and I felt like some of the dialogue there. It wasn't just the chess player in me that was upset. This is probably the episode of all 7 that has the least amount of chess. We're going to definitely get back into a lot of fun in the next episode, but. So I don't even know what to say. I mean, the things you were saying, I'll just say I agree. I thought they were odd. I do have some notes about, where we at here. I did make a note about the plane. I just wanted to say that I really like the line where right before she talks to Beth about Manuel and her excitement about Mexico City, she kind of says, "What are you reading?" And she says, "Pawn structure analysis." And she says, "Well, that sounds exciting," sarcastically. And Beth goes, "It is." I just wanted to say I loved that dialogue as someone who also has always found pawn structures fascinating, and I've even been made fun of that by my peers and things like that, like Danny Rensch's obsession with pawn structure. I have tons of videos on chess.com. Like literally, if you Google like pawn structure chess videos like Danny Rensch, I have a ton. I have like, and I've always been big about the concept of seeing the forest through the trees in chess, because what defines the best players at the high levels is always pawn play, because they're the only pieces you can't move back. And what that means is every weakness and every high level like concept of chess is based around positional strategy, which is exposing what the pawns have given you. And anyway, so I just love that because they continue to develop like what this young, aggressive American needs to jump level is pawn structure chess. She says it is fascinating. And I just had to say, I love that. Won my heart. That line right there. Loved it.
It is good too, because, when they get to the first match, which I want to, they blend a lot of elements in between chess when things are happening, but like fascinating when we get to the very first match with Octavio, they say, because a lot of this is all done, they say it in Spanish and it's translated, and Heather was like, this Spanish is on point, by the way. Right. They say like she wins like basically all pawns, like it's all pawns. So, like she came off of reading this book about pawn structures to basically destroying Octavio with all pawns. But right. Mike and Matt show up, man. Mike and Matt, stars of this episode, by the way. Middle game, which funnily enough, this is the middle episode in the series, and we all know that the middle game sometimes isn't all that exciting, which may be why this episode isn't all that exciting. Not to say that all middle games aren't exciting, Danny, I'm just saying, you're halfway through a match and you're like, okay, get it over with already.
I'm with you. I'm with you. I did make a note here that Mike and Matt's appearance is a bit odd. And the reason I said that is because it's almost like they had to have someone for Beth to dialogue her thought process with, right?
Yeah.
On like in the lobby, before the chess games, like there's the scene where she comes out of the elevator right before the game with Borgov we'll get to, and Mike and Matt just like walk up behind her, kind of like she has someone there with her, which I thought was cool. It's totally movie magic and the drama, but I can say like in an elite event in Mexico City or Havana, Cuba, like where some of the events south of the border in the U.S. took place during that time, Buenos Aires, like they would not have been there. I will say that Mike and Matt did not belong in Mexico City. but,
Yeah, even they
but
even
they were
say
there.
like they're like, oh,
Yeah,
like he like Matt loves a beating or whatever. Mike or
right.
whichever one was playing, because only one of them was playing. And it's crazy because this very first match, by the way, which is against Octavio Marenko, who she destroys. He was an international grandmaster, not to be confused with an international master. And I had to go back because
I made that note that they use the term, right, and I love that because you and I had just spent so much time talking about it in the last episode, that the actual title of grandmaster is international grandmaster, and she says it there to add the correct emphasis on the wrong syllable. I loved it.
Now, but how would she get paired up against an international grandmaster? Because in this tournament, is it more of the traditional tournament like you were talking about, where like one of the top players would play one of the lower players?
So that note is exactly why Mike and Matt didn't belong there,
Oh,
because
okay.
she was invited to play in Mexico City,
Mm.
and an invitational would imply that people are being brought in from all over the world, like what happens in Paris later on in the show, like what eventually happens in Moscow in the end. Like international invitationals would be for grandmasters or up and comer talented players, right? That is what's about to take place in Tata Steel and Viking Z, which is in the Netherlands. It's an event that we've partnered with in broadcast for last 5 years or so. And it's one of the longest lasting kind of elite events. And so the field is a combination of Magnus Carlsen, Anish Giri, top world's elite, and then a few like players who are Dutch, right, local to the organizers, who don't necessarily belong in that level, but they're given the opportunity, right? This is a very typical sort of way that these elite events will run. An organizer who's engaging, and whether it's for local philanthropic reasons, whether there's a brand being promoted, whatever it is, that's exactly how it would be. So even Beth Harmon's invite is a bit of a stretch to be in an event with Borgov, right? This guy's the world champion and number one. And we know that while she did just tie for the U.S. championship, at this point, she's still talking about the international and grandmaster titles like there's something she aspires to be, right? So I kind of made a note of this because we can assume at this point Beth Harmon is not an IM or a GM yet, meaning she's not an international or grandmaster. And I think I'm right about that. And if that's the case, that part of it is just odd. You would never see a young, up and coming, talented American in an event with the reigning world champion. But we're sort of looking past that because we're sort of seeing that Beth Harmon is not your normal prodigy. She's like a Bobby Fischer, and she's being given this opportunity. She would be playing grandmasters and international grandmasters, but Mike and Matt would not be at an event like this.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I could see them going just to like watch, but it doesn't make sense for them to be playing in any regards. In it. Now,
I want to say before we move on to this, because while we've been chatting here, I've been listening to every word, paying attention, but just doing my own research. I'm actually so I took for granted how important Mexico City is, because Mexico City and in future events did host major events, and eventually you have the Linares tournament, which was played in both Spain and Mexico, like a rare tournament, a super tournament throughout the 90s that like basically had players travel from like Spain to Mexico. Very cool. But actually at this time, like the biggest events that were south of the border were in Havana, Cuba, which were homages to the great and late Jose Raul Capablanca. You had Mar del Plata, which of course is in Argentina. And so there actually weren't events in Mexico City in the 60s. There were events in South America, Havana being the most regular one. And so looking at the consistency of the schedule, I feel like Havana, there was also Buenos Aires in 64, which Carries and Petrosian won. So I'm looking at it and remembering like Mexico City, while it did eventually become a city of some major events, at this time would not be totally fair to say that. Likewise with Paris, actually. Again, Paris held some major events, but you were more likely to see events not just in Moscow, but in Amsterdam. Um, I was looking at in Sochi, of course, Russia or Siberia. Anyway, it's interesting. Sorry, just dropped there. So I feel like they nailed it, but I guess I gave them. I mean, Viking Z actually started in '68, which is now one of the longest running, basically elite events in the world. And again, it's coming up in January. But again, I guess Paris would be a little bit of a stretch. So I gave them the benefit of the doubt there. I think it's fine. They do hit the nail on the head overall, but there was no super tournament in Paris in the 60s. And even though there were many in the surrounding European cities, Eastern Europe and that stuff. So anyway, just have to say that I got to correct myself when I'm wrong. There you go.
Well, and it's fascinating because also the Aztec Palace where this was taking place in Mexico City doesn't exist. Obviously, it's a show, right? Not everything exists here, but I will say that the hotel was beautiful, and that hotel is actually a real hotel. Is in Berlin, so that's a fun fact.
There you go, fun fact. All right, so look at us. We're learning so much together.
A few things here, Danny. Mike, Matt, her mom really push her to relax the day before the match. She's cramming. I have it written down on here. Danny, what do you do the day before a match? Do you relax? Do you cram? Are you, polishing your openings, your end games? What are you doing?
So love that you asked that question. It was also one of the things that I noted. I felt like the dialogue that took place between the mom and Beth was actually kind of cool. And I had both like applause, little golf clap going on watching, and then also some like, that's interesting. But so where does that premise start, right? It starts with the mom saying, you don't always have to work so hard. And she's like, I'm playing these guys. If I lose, right, that's coming out of our capital, right? So she's kind of threatening the mom where she lives, which is in the pocketbook, right? Like, hey, let's not forget I'm the paycheck here. And then she's like, yeah, but I've seen that and they call you an intuitive player, do they not, right? And Beth is like, yeah, right. But an intuitive player, well, kind of an interesting way to refer to it, is definitely something that you would refer to different people as, like someone who typically trusts their intuition and isn't bringing a ton of technical theoretical knowledge, at least at that stage. How could she? She's 17 years old. And she was kind of trying to say, like, look, from what I understand about you, Beth, you're at your best when you're just relaxed, when you're trusting yourself, you're trusting your intuition, and let's not overthink this. So I think that all that was actually very good and interesting advice. And we end up finding out as Beth kind of starts wandering the city, she eventually runs into Borgov and his wife and their family at the zoo, right, later on. So we see that Borgov as well is enjoying kind of the rest day and not overbooking or overcramming in the books. But also I felt like there was a little bit of a of a thing that says like, hey, if you relax, that's when you're at your best. And I actually made notes of the all the quotes I have, of like, the harder I work, the luckier I get, right? Like Lee Trevino in golf, right? I think that he said it first. There are all kinds of phrases that like imply you work hard so that when you're in front of, the pressure filled moment, whether that's on camera or at the board, you can relax, right? And trust yourself, right? So I don't really agree that like walking away from what you need to focus on is an ultimate recipe towards success, right? I mean, working hard allows you to relax sometimes because you feel like you put in your time. Now you can trust your instincts and let it happen, right? So, and there's a lot of things about that. And then you see that the mom is one of the themes throughout this is the mom is consistently what I would say like a slippery slope almost. Like, I don't want to say the mom is a bad influence, but if we go back to like episode 3, like giving alcohol, and then here, like she kind of gets Beth to kind of loosen up, but also lose her focus a little bit. And we know that Beth then kind of engages in a few too many alcoholic beverages as she's wandering Mexico City, right? So I don't even know. Like I both applauded the advice. I think that a good coach will get someone to appreciate there's nothing you could study this day that's going to win you the match tomorrow. I agree with that. And you should never like convince yourself that you're going to change the game plan a day before a match and be at your best. For sure. You have to just trust what's gotten you there. But at the same time, like, I don't always know that the mom is the best influence on Beth and her ambitions to just do what she knows she needs to do, which is become a better technical player so she can compete with these guys.
Yeah,
Anyway,
and
sorry.
her mom doesn't know who she's up against, right? She doesn't understand that she's about to go up against a grandmaster and against Borgov. Like she understands that, but I don't think she understands the difficulty and the talent of these players. Even though Beth has been crushing it, she sort of was like, "Hey, you're invincible. Like you're the best out there. But she's not the best out there, and it's clear, right? And she has a lot to learn, and we see this flashback, by the way, too, which I thought was very of the moment from Mr. Scheibel. There's a brand new scene out of nowhere where he's like, you're two sides of the coin. There's much anger in you. A Star Wars
Yeah, yeah.
reference. I don't
I know. I
know.
love that. I had the same note. Go ahead. Go ahead.
And he goes, your time, this is your time in the sun, but for how long, right? And
Yeah.
we actually see that later on in one of the other matches, sort of talking about a younger prodigy from Russia. But this flashback is she continuously gets flashbacks of Mr. Scheibel in many of the episodes here. But yeah, I love that. Like there's much anger in you. It's two sides of the coin. Like, you may be basking in the sun right now, but for how long, right? And to me, that is like, hey, you really need to focus, clamper down, but also realize that while you may be on this huge incline forever,
Yeah.
you're not there forever, right? Like
Right.
for however good right now the players of Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura are, like 30 years from now, they still may be on top, right? But there's going to be new, younger players, which we see in this episode, by the way, that
Right.
maybe be taking your spotlight from you.
Well, there's a lot of dialogue there, and it actually happens with the young Griev, as we'll discuss. And so, I want to save my zinger for what I feel the overarching message and theme
Mm.
of the show was for later, because you already kind of asked that when the mother when Beth calls her mom before her her big the everything that happens there that night, and with the
Mm.
boy and everything, and the schmuck, sorry, not the boy. I think there's an overarching theme to this middle game episode that is cemented by how it ends and
Mm.
by some of the conversations that took place here with the mom pushing her to do more than just study before a big chess tournament and stuff. And so on that note, I actually do feel like the episode delivered, and that was kind of my big zinger takeaway at the end. I was like,
Mm.
here's what the message is he's trying to that the writing is trying to say, the director's trying to say, and that it's setting the tone for the back half of of this show, not Beth's life, because
Yeah.
she's still so young. But so I'm with you, and I think it's both like really good, and I think because of the way they end it, I'm going to give them like the big thumbs up at the end,
Mm.
because I feel like the message gets delivered. But yeah, there's also some just kind of interesting dialogue there. Like who knows what the best really would have been for Beth Harmon at that age. So
Yeah. I think the overarching for me would be sometimes you got to stop and smell the roses, right?
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
all right. So let's get really quick out of here. First match, like we said, Octavio Marenko finished in 31 moves with a mating net at the end. Now, here's a funny part that I wrote down for this is she says, that there's, the language barrier, right? They don't speak the same language.
Mhm.
And I thought this was, I wanted to ask you about that in your matches. But also, the very first match, Marenko comes over and like whispers in her ear and then sits down. It's like very weird. Did you
Yeah,
catch that?
yeah, it was odd and kind of out of place. It could happen, but it was I don't know. I didn't. All I noted about both that and kind of the way they described that she beats him with pawns, right?
Hmm.
Um, is just I don't know. I mean, I think it's just adding the chess to it, adding to the the development of her character, and that again she's consistently socially a little bit feeling a little socially out of place. That's how she feels a lot of the time. Now she's out of place because she doesn't speak the language of these guys. And then this guy whispers in her ear, kind of like making her maybe feel further isolated. Maybe it was something
Hmm.
sort of sexist. You don't know, right? It was awkward. And again, they don't really get into it other than she destroys him with a lot of pawns regardless.
Yeah, we do talk about that, right? I mean, in this time era, Heather was asking me a lot about this, and while there were, female chess players, like in the show, we see that it's a minority, and especially in this time era. And you're right. I mean, would Marenko have done that to Borgov? I can guarantee you not. Right?
No,
Like
no.
it's
Yeah.
again. I think her being who she is, a young woman coming up in chess in this era, there is some disrespect. There's not the respect
Yep.
given yet that
Yep.
she's earning through this. But we then see, we learn a Queen's Gambit decline, destroying Diedrich from Austria, and this is one of my favorite there's a lot of times when Beth destroys chess players, but this was a
Right.
good one because he looked shook.
Yeah. Yeah,
Like
I
he looked,
agree. Like, that was really funny. It's like his face, it's like he's seen a ghost and then been
yeah.
slapped by the ghost. So,
Uh,
that was great, and I think that's kind of I almost rolled the first one with, regardless of the kind of the sexist ear whispering, "Why would you do that to your opponent?" That's not a thing. I've never had someone come up and whisper in my ear before they sit down in front of me. Anyway, so yeah.
let's have a good game, Danny. What are you doing, Danny? Not
um,
okay. Not okay.
so yeah, I just kind of wrapped them both into like she's setting the tone for her prowess, right, in the event, and now she beats Diedrich and beats Diedrich nicely. And
Yes.
Diedrich will never be the same after that game. That's
No.
what like his career went downhill. That's what happened.
He walks away with his tail between his legs. He just like leaves the table and it's go time.
Yeah.
No, we get to some chess finally because those first two games we don't see anything. There's nothing to map on it, and we get right into the next match, which is fantastic. By the way, this is one of very fascinating games of chess because Beth is put in a new position against Georgy Gerev from Russia, a young Russian kid who's uh,
Gruyev. It's Gruyev.
Girev.
Yeah.
I don't know how to
Go
say
ahead.
it. Say it.
Gruyev.
Okay,
Gruyev.
perfect.
Georgy Gruyev.
Georgy Gerev. So this is great. As he does speak some English, so he's able to talk or whatever. This may be the first time she's played a younger opponent,
Right.
and this is a fascinating match. By the way, we get a Sicilian, of course, open Sicilian on the board right away. In the show notes, by the way, for this and the Borgov match, we have the openings and the end game for both of these, so you can follow along at home. I personally did the openings for both of these games.
And
So
I
you
love
can,
reviewing them, especially because you consistently do an amazing job.
because they skip moves and I have to figure it out on
Yeah.
my mind. And I think I
Yeah,
did.
and
Okay.
no, and again, you're not a professional chess player, James, but you are acting like one on this show, young man. You are crushing it.
And at least this is a pretty standard opening. We've seen this many a times from Beth. We see, we see a Sicilian open,
Yep.
Sicilian defense
Well, and
opening.
she's white in this one. And she also
Mhm.
plays the Sicilian, as we know, as black many times. But yes,
Yes.
you're right. So yeah, she's white in this case, and you nailed the opening.
Yeah,
Yep.
she takes her knights out, and then we see a French variation with him taking knight e3, knight king 3. What is it? Something
Well, so
pawn king e3 6.
pawn it's pawn to king 4. We get pawn to queen's bishop 4. That's a Sicilian. This is e4 c5, and then after knight f3 we get e6. So that's pawn to king 3, or pawn to king 6, depending on the board orientation. And after d4, we'll just go with what the algebraic is. Yeah, we have this. So it's called a French variation early with e6, but this is actually and then they get it right if you get to move 4. They call it a Taimanov. So this is a Paulson or Taimanov kind of Sicilian, and that's defined by the e6 structure. Versus on move 2, for example, if you back up our eager chess listeners, the move knight to c6, we will see Beth plays later on when she's black against Borgov. So on move 2, she plays knight to queen's bishop 3 or knight to c6 later. Also d6, pawn to queen 3, or d6 is a move that's very popular. So e6 is called a French version at first, and that's because our ECO is designed to really map out everything under the sun. But really, once d4 takes, knight c6 is played, we are in a Taimanov Sicilian. And the main line that's played here, I believe this actually is a famous game, but I didn't look it up ahead of time. But we've got a Scheveningen structure. Once you have pawns on e6 and d6 for black, if you go to like move 6 after knight f6 for black, this is a Scheveningen pawn structure. Scheveningen is also a name of a tournament style where all play all in like a kind of a team format. Well, I don't know if that ever actually comes up in this show, but Scheveningen here is the opening. She plays a very aggressive line with f4, the Matanovich attack, which is what f4 is. You can play so many of the moves there. I do not play the f4 ideas, and he plays. This is a little bit odd in terms of. I actually think this isn't exactly the move order, and I'm sorry, buddy. I just realized going through it, you missed one move. That's okay. I love you. Hey, don't get mad. Don't get mad. Okay,
I was
the
close.
move.
I knew I was
Yeah,
close. I mean, I got the board to where it was, but I might have been off after this
the
one.
the only thing you miss is bishop e7 first before knight g4, because if knight
Mm,
g4 is played on move 7 there, she would take it with her queen, still on d1. So in the game, actually, bishop e7 is played, then queen d2 from Beth, then knight g4 from our buddy
Gerev.
Gurev.
Gerev. Gerev.
And then so after queen to d2, knight g4, you get bishop e2, e5 played by black, knight f3, and then the capture on e3 and the capture on f4. So the final position is just like what you had, except there's moves bishop e7 and bishop e2 thrown in for both white and black there.
Oh, I see. Got it. That makes sense. Yes. I was very close in it. We'll put the final updated one as we walk through. We always do that because this is fun as Danny gives me. It's hard because, if you are really into this chess, you're trying to watch it and they skip random moves. And at the same time, I wish that chess.com would also put the 1 through 8 reversed on the other side. That would also be very helpful.
Okay. That's good to know, actually.
Of the board, because, when you say, for example, if I have white on the bottom,
right,
and you're like, oh, pawn, E3 or whatever. It's actually 6 on the board, right? It's maybe I can tap on it or something, change it. But it's like, when you're in the Explorer, you can only see 1 and you're shifting in your mind. But this was a fascinating match in general. And I think that Gurev was also fascinating, right? He's super young. He's very respectful. He's like, it's an honor. It's an honor, Miss Harmon, right? He's like excited to play against her. The play is fast, by the way.
They play super fast. I made a note of that here, which was interesting. It was like a young guy kind of like trying to prove himself to Beth Harmon there. Go ahead.
And then we fast forward 5 hours, Danny.
Yeah.
And this is fascinating because this had never happened. Gurev, he goes, we've played for 5 hours. We should adjourn. And I was like, holy crap. Like I have no idea what's about to happen. And they have to she has to seal a move. Danny, explain one, by the way. This is when Heather stopped and she said, wait a second, how did it go 5 hours? Because I thought you told me that Danny discussed 2 hours, 40 moves, right?
Yeah, but it's 2 hours for both sides. So that's already 4 hours total possible.
But
right?
they're at 5 hours.
Yeah. And they're playing past the 40 move mark, which means they've been given additional allotted time. So a very, very typical time control is 2 hours for each side to start. So that's already 4 hours of potential total time. And you have to make 40 moves total, sometimes 50 moves, depending on the time control. 50 moves was sometimes more standard then, but you got 40 or 50 moves within those first 2 hours. But if you reach that, you reach the 40 or 50 move mark, each side gets sometimes either an additional half an hour each, or sometimes an additional full hour. Tournaments in the 90s, when I was up and coming, and in the early 2000s, it was the most popular time control in the world was 40 moves in 2 hours, sudden death 60. So that meant a total possible game of 6 hours long.
Wow.
But that was because in the sudden death era, our era, there were no adjournments. So back then, a more typical time control would be 40 or 50 moves in 2 hours, plus 60 minutes for the remaining moves. And at any moment, someone can adjourn the game.
Well, what happens? Okay, hold on. Before you go to adjournment, what happens if you don't reach the amount of moves required? Is it a draw? Does someone resign?
No, you lose on time. You lose on time. So sometimes, in fact, the most common amount of time a game would last is probably roughly a 3.5 to 3 hour and 45 minute mark, because most games someone would win right around move 40. So, one side's used 90 minutes and they're leading. The other side has used almost all of their 4 hours because they've been getting outplayed. So they typically are taking a little more time to think about it. They're under time pressure, and our game is ending on move 37, 38, right? This is a very, very common pace of a game and the type of result you would see. This game is, and what they're depicting is a very accurate, very long struggle, right? This is a really deep game. And I believe we have it noted in our thing as, I think it was Yakovenko Stellwagen.
Yes.
Yes. So Yakovenko Stellwagen is an actual game. And that's the position they are referencing with the eventual tactic that we see Beth uncork after adjournment with this H5 move. But I don't want to skip past any of your questions about adjournment before we get into that.
But yeah, how does this adjournment work? There's some stipulations here. This is fascinating because it just stops at the end of it. He's they kind of agree to stop play for the day, and at least what my mind is this. Okay, this is how I explained adjournment to Heather, and then you can correct me, because she's like, what's about happening here? And I said, I think what happened here is they've agreed that you're going to take a break, go to the next day because they played for so long. They're still within their time limits. They've played enough moves. Beth has to decide what her next move is, so she cannot study the board and decide and something
find out
different.
The best move. Yeah,
exactly.
That's 100% correct. So you see him, the tournament director, come over, the arbiter, and she has to seal her move. So I had a couple notes that are more like, bring in how realistic is the chess of this. So first of all, we explained the time controls, totally legit. We explained that a game would be adjourned after about the 5-hour mark. This is also totally legit. The only thing that's not legit is that the young guy is kind of like, hey, we've been playing for 5 hours. Can we call it a break? Like that's not a normal thing you would ever say to your opponent. And although he's just like a kid and he's exhausted. And then also the fact that he played the move King H8 so quickly is actually the move that in theory kind of loses the game. Now black is in big trouble, but bishop to G7 blocking the check by the rook would have not allowed the H5 tactic that Beth Harmon plays. Now white is still in control because of the rook on the 7th rank, but the game would have been much more dynamic. And without turning this into a long kind of crazy chess lecture, but King H8 is actually kind of accurate and both. It needs to be noted, King H8 played out of exhaustion by our young 13-year-old is the move that kind of loses the game in a forcing manner when Beth finds and seals the move H5 at the break.
Yeah, he puts his king in the corner. I'm just not saying that's the best move, but this is fascinating to me because Beth knows her next move. He doesn't know her move, but what this allows Beth to do is study the chessboard. She's annoyed. I think at the end of this day, she's super annoyed. He goes and he asks about drive-in movies and Elvis things and all this stuff. It's super cute. And Beth is just not having anything to do with it because she just played chess for 5 hours. She's super annoyed that she hasn't crushed this kid by now, right? He's so young. And, but I think she has the advantage, right? If we look at the chess.com analysis, this podcast brought to you by chess.com, where you can play chess online. That's the advertisement. So she's already winning in this point. According to the analysis board, she's already winning, and she knows her next move, which surprisingly enough, H5, this move, you can click on the show notes, brings her down in the analysis here, by the way. It brings it not 50-50, but she's still winning even with this move. It brings it down a little bit, but she has all night to study the board, which I think is adjournment is kind of crazy because whoever's about to play the next move, if they can memorize the chessboard, right, which it's on the demo board or whatever, so it's not that hard. She just stayed up all night and just memorize and figure out everything in general, which I think is crazy.
Yeah, I mean, and so what was your thought about, I want to give my thoughts about it. So what you said is so she plays H5, and even though it initially brings her down, I will say the longer you give the ancient to think, it actually goes back up. It is a brilliant pawn sacrifice, which is kind of why the young Grieve missed it. And I'm gonna assume that people at this point have clicked the analysis link by James, and we're looking at the position with the black king on H8, and go ahead and play the move pawn to H5 on the board.
Yep.
The whole idea is when black takes this pawn, you would then play G6, which threatens checkmate with rook H7 because the bishop on D5 guards the G8 escape square for the black king. And so this pawn sack is kind of the key. And there's really no way out of it. Eventually what happens here is black has to part ways with a piece, and the game is over. So H5 actually, even though initially computers often sort of go no, don't give up material, but if you give it time to think, it's actually the brilliant tactic that was played in the real life game between Yakovenko and Stellwagen. So, and then the way that she kind of acts, right? Because that's what we're talking about now, right? So she plays H5. He knows he's in trouble, but she basically is playing the game in her head the rest of the time, getting up from the board, kind of wandering around, and only coming back to the board when she hears him made a move and she hears that big wooden clock tick, right?
Mhm.
Um, so how realistic did that seem to you as a non-chess player before I respond?
I mean, it was sassy and I loved it. It was
Yeah?
great
Okay,
film
cool.
because it really showed that Beth knew she was winning, that she was going to win. She's played out every scenario in her mind. She knew what he was going to play. However, um, if I was him, I would have been pissed. I don't know, because there was one point where she's like really far away looking at him. There's another point where she's like tapping her foot nonstop. I don't know if it was to get under his skin. I don't think it's realistic at this level of play necessarily. I do think it is realistic that maybe after 5 hours or 4 hours, someone might get up and use the, do something. But after the first move get up, I don't know. I think that was kind of, I think it was a tactic. And if it was a tactic, it was a very good tactic to.
Okay, cool. I love that because first of all, it was sassy, it was good drama, and it clearly shows, you know, that that she knows exactly what's going on, and this kid is kind of out of his league, right? And now you kind of see the kid kind of squirm, and he's kind of cute, right? Kind of frustrated with her, right? But now I'm going to say this: not only is it all those things, which makes for good TV and good drama for someone to kind of just outplay the person, it's actually not that unrealistic.
Oh,
Now, it's
really?
not the most what Beth did was just not the most ethical thing in
Mm,
that it kind of shows like she's impatient and kind of tired of the young kid and uh but that does happen at tournaments where like someone is just like beating the other person and basically spends very little time at the board, and the tapping of the foot is definitely like kind of obnoxious and unethical by Beth. It's something a young player would do, but you would never see Borgov do, right? But even in a real chess tournament, like that's something a young player would do actually, and like that's something that I didn't find the scene unrealistic in terms of chess at all. And Shauna asked me the same thing, and she's been to tournaments, so she knows you're allowed to walk around, and she's
mhm.
watched me play super long games where she can come in and observe. But she was like, would someone ever do that to someone like that at an elite event? I was like, a young player, like, yes. And then they would be like quickly, like, basically talked to by the old school people. It's the kind of thing like in baseball, you would get a pitch thrown at you the next time you come to the plate.
Yeah.
Right. It's like someone like, trotting a little too slowly around the bases and like bragging about the home run. And the next time you come up, like you get a pitch thrown at you, right? Now, I'm
Mm.
not saying that's not good and not safe, and please stop throwing 95-mile-an-hour fastballs at people's heads. It's not a good thing. But that's it's actually very realistic, and the fact that it kind of gets under his skin is also like a plus. There is a bit of chess that I think people don't always know about that is a bit of a mind game and kind of an athletic sport in the sense of your physical presence can sometimes intimidate someone, right? And Gary Kasparov was actually very very well known for being an intimidating presence for his opponents. And Gary's never going to listen to this podcast, so I don't care. I mean, there's also a lot of conversation that people, basically thought he was a jerk at the board, and that Gary Kasparov was the most dominant, figure throughout the 80s and into the early 2000s. Many argue still the GOAT, right? A lot of people say Magnus Carlsen has not surpassed Gary in terms of the greatest of all time. And I don't know that I disagree. Gary's dominance of his generation is still something that just incredible, right? But Gary was also known, like there were rumors that Gary like would kick his opponents under the table, like accidentally, right?
Mhm.
But or not, right? Or he was always known for like making moves and like screwing the piece into the board. Like you make a move and if it's going, he like screws it in a few times and then hits the clock. Or like staring down his opponents even on his turn. Like Gary was a freaking badass, right? Like at the board, and he was intimidating. And so again, there are players who have said that they really didn't feel like that was the ethical and correct thing to do. And there are other players like that would argue, like, look, like chess may be known as a passive sport, but it's a sport where like I'm there to dominate you and you're going to dominate me. And I don't give a oh, wait, I almost said the S word. I guess we're allowed to curse. I mean, I don't give a bleep what you think about me. And now at the same time, if you ever do something consistently to like bother your opponent, for example, if the young Griev had called an arbiter and said, will you please tell her to stop tapping her foot? The
Mhm.
arbiter would surely side with Griev, like
Yeah.
not Beth, right? What she was doing, if it had been called on her, would have been like, hey, you're being obnoxious. But very often people will do this to you and you won't call it on them because you don't want to show like weakness, right? So what you do is your job is to ignore them and focus through the distraction. So I really like this whole thing, and you can tell in my voice I'm passionate to talk about it because there's a lot about like the physical presence, the physical things that take place within like a chess tournament that like don't get talked about, and I don't even think about it that much anymore because I got so used to it playing in those types of tournaments, and now I don't even I don't play in World Elite events anymore, but that's that's not totally unrealistic and unreasonable that like the top there are top players who are active now. I won't say there are reputations of some that people don't enjoy playing and more than others, right? And there are stories like I already was very direct about the Kasparov stories of him being a guy that was just intimidating AF and was known for doing some stuff. Fischer in the 60s and in his world championship match, there's a lot of famous stories. I don't know if anyone ever saw Pawn Sacrifice. Did you see Pawn Sacrifice with Tobey Maguire?
Oh, I know. I have not, but I've been thinking about our season 3 of
Yeah, I
Blunders
mean,
already, and I think we may do chess movie breakdowns. By the way,
yeah.
that's what I've been thinking. I didn't tell you
Oh,
that
okay.
yet,
Well,
but
oh, sweet. Well, no. So Pawn Sacrifice is I mean, that'll I won't say I'll save it because I've seen it and whatever. But when they get into the actual match that goes down between Fischer and Spassky, which is played by Tobey Maguire and Lev Schreiber in 1972 in Reykjavik, Iceland, they do a fantastic job of really bringing to life the mental battleground that was taking place. And Fischer like demanding things and Spassky denying them and complaining about the lighting and the chairs. Like this kind of stuff happened. So, all right, I digress. We'll come back. But my point is, it's not that unreasonable, even if it's not the most ethical thing to do. It's also something that happens more often than you would think.
Gotcha. That's fast. I mean, it's a fascinating insight, and and I think that we actually see a little bit later during the Borgov, like someone takes a photo and the arbiter goes and like shuts it down, right? And it's similar in golf too, by the way. Like golf, I was a golfer back in the day, and if you have people that are watching or doing other things, like the arbiter will kind of come around and do stuff. Now, I will say this though: the Jakovenko Stellwagen match, to get to the position in which we get to in the show notes of this match, is on play 42, right? So we can. I'm
Yes.
not going to say it took the same amount of moves, but are we looking at somewhere around 40-ish moves? And if so, does that even make sense for the 5-hour mark? I mean, it's kind of weird, I will say.
I think it can make sense in the sense of, so if we go with the time control I said, 40 moves in 2 hours, it's not crazy to believe that sometimes you would spend a significant amount of time like right after time control because you get more time. So for example, very commonly, they've been struggling, we're both under time pressure. We've both used 3 hours and or an hour and 55 minutes. Like we barely make time control and move 40. Now we get this extra hour each. A lot of times people will slow down and really think through, um, what the next few moves are, um, and um, and so again, I think tit for tat, whatever. But no, I don't think it's unrealistic, and I think they did a pretty good job there.
Now, do you know the next move? So Beth plays H5. We don't see the board. Do you know in your mind how she beat him if you were to walk this out?
So she played H5. There's actually a great video by Danny King, who's a friend of mine, and give a shout out to his YouTube channel. He breaks down the whole Yakovenko Stellwagen game from that position. But I guess for our podcast, I'll say that yeah, again after H5, it's I don't want to say easily winning, but it's very straightforward. Like black is in big trouble. And again, the point is because you're getting a forced pass pawn with this pawn sack, no matter how black takes it, the king on H8 gets in a mating net and black has to start giving up material.
Oh.
So I think it goes on longer. This is the note I made. I'll say this. It goes on longer than they really do a justice to with her like walking around because they're more focused on the drama of her intimidating him. But if you remember, she walks back to the board like how many times? What,
Three
three,
times.
four,
Three times.
three times?
Yeah.
Okay, so you made, and I can tell you many more moves than 3 moves were played in this game.
That's
Like
what I was looking.
literally,
I was like,
like
oh,
20.
I was like, oh,
Yeah.
maybe she puts the, knight the rook up. It's like, and then I was like, okay, but then what's
No,
her
but
next
even they
move?
flash the final position. They flash the final position, and you can see it's like way down the road, right?
Gotcha.
Like
Okay.
a lot of things have come off the board. In fact, I can even set up the final position haven't done it yet, but I'll save it for our viewers who want to see it, as far as why Stellwagen or Grieve resigns, and it is easily 15 moves later. So
Yes.
they don't really do that accurately, but it's not super relevant. I think it's just caught up in the emotions of the moment, and she beats him, but no, they don't. The game is not over in 3 moves.
Gotcha. Yeah, and he resigns in the traditional,
Yeah, I love that.
old-fashioned way,
Yeah,
knocks over his king in
yep,
general. This is great because Beth at this point has brought herself back together. She's realizing, hey, this kid at some point was one of the hardest matches I've played. She acknowledges that, even though I think it's a lie to make him feel okay about it. She says, you're the best I've ever played, which I don't think that's true. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. I feel like she just said that to say that because, she's like, I have never been to the drive-ins and blah, 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 and all this stuff kind of like, is personal again. But then he's like talking about that he wants to be world champion and blah, blah, blah by 16. And she's like, but then what? And then what? And he's like, I don't understand.
I love that.
I don't understand. And Heather stopped me. She's like, well, what is going on in Russia in chess? And this time I'm like, to me, talking to Danny, it was a very different shift, right? I think that in Russia, and correct me if I'm wrong, when we talk about the Russia 60s, 50s, 70s, I feel as though it was like Russia was the best at the thing, right? They had the tops in the world, but they literally seeked out the players and handcrafted them to be the best players in the world compared to America, which is like, hey, you might be good, but you're going to have to fend for yourself to the top, right? It's not like the Olympics in the way
Yep.
that, like, to me, it was chess was like the Olympics in Russia compared to chess in America wasn't that way, or nor have I, don't know if it ever has been in a way.
So totally accurate, and they do a great job of kind of depicting that. And remember that the Soviet Union was a world power. It's not just Russia, right? It
Yeah,
was the
correct.
Soviet
Soviet
Union.
Union. Yes.
And the only reason I keep clarifying that is because it's well, one, it's a very important storyline as we get into the the parts with Borgov, and we talk about the KGB being with him in this episode. I've
Yep.
not got notes on that, but it's the Soviet Union was obviously a massive, amount of now like multiple countries and states, right? So like, I mean, entire Eastern Europe, right? It wasn't just
Hmm.
Russia. You're
Yeah.
talking like so uh and yeah, it was I wouldn't say it's exactly like, oh my god, a hero is born and they show up and they're like, your child is the second coming of this person, right? Like
Yeah.
obviously they didn't have that kind of foresight, but because chess was so systemic and a part of the culture in the Soviet Union, talented uh players were recognized very early and given opportunities super early, and then the cream of the crop rises even from that cream of the crop, and then the cream of
Mm.
the crop of that, right? So the Botvinnik chess school, I talked about Botvinnik being the father of the Soviet chess, really just regime. He was a world champion, but he's often referred to as the father of the Soviet Union chess. And the Botvinnik chess school is where Garry Kasparov, I just mentioned, the 13th world champion, right? The intimidating Garry Kasparov, Anatoly Karpov, uh, you know, you have all these guys, Spassky, Petrosian, those guys were kind of rivals of Botvinnik, but that whole next generation that came up through the 70s, 80s, and 90s all attended the Botvinnik School of Chess, like
Mm.
for sure, right? And the talented players that were recognized young were given tons of opportunity. And so for him to become world champion is not only always been his dream, but probably all that's been instilled in him as his life option forever, right? And so I'll just say now, I think that dialogue that goes down between Beth and Grieve is kind of like Beth's mom and her, and that the overarching note that I made about the show, which is that to me the message from the very beginning is there's more to life than just chess, right? And like you said, it's stop and smell the roses, but it's like, hey, like the beginning of the episode, it's about her, you know, becoming a woman and losing her virginity and all the things that go there, and then it's like the mom pushing her to get outside the box in terms of what might help her play her best chess. It's not just X's and O's, right? It's get out and smell the roses. And then it's like her direct question of this kid being like, well, what's after you reach world champion? And he's like, I don't understand, right? And it's like she's delivering a message to him, right? A young person growing up in the Soviet Union who's clearly fascinated by American culture with his questions about the drive-in movies, right?
Hmm.
And she kind of gets him thinking, hey, there's more to life than just chess, little guy. right?
Yeah.
And I think that that's just kind of the overarching message of this episode. And now, now we're going to get into the big, the big moments that happen here in the end, not just between her and Borgov, but in terms of what happens with her mom.
Very true. Yeah. And we see the next scene, the elevator scene, as I like to call it, where Beth, we obviously know, knows some Russian. Not sure the extent of Russian that she knows, but we can assume that she clearly knows that Borgov, and then also two members who are the second and third best players in the world, are with Borgov, sort of like the crew, if you will,
Yep.
and also some handlers, I like to call them, which Mike and Matt say they're KGB,
Right.
with them, which I think they said like, oh, so he doesn't run off, which
Right. So this is it. This is the zinger. So that is a very real thing.
I believe it. Yeah.
Like, yeah, and not only like a very real thing, but Spassky and Karpov were consistently trailed as they traveled internationally, as were many other top Russian players, not even the world's most talented. In fact, any tournament internationally where Soviet I keep saying Russian, Soviet players were there was almost always the presence of a KGB agent. In fact, my coach, the late Igor Ivanov, who died of cancer some years back, he actually trained me for many years. He was also an alcoholic and very well known throughout the chess community as like some crazy stuff would happen at chess tournaments he was at, like like pouring hot coffee on himself on the board and not even noticing that he did because he was so drunk. I won't get into all that, but like my coach Igor Ivanov was legendary in terms of not just his alcohol consumption but his chess. But he was also legendary because he was one of the first really like publicized and glorified defections from the Soviet Union. In fact, he played in the Capablanca Memorial in Havana, Cuba in 1980. Igor won. God, I know his whole life, but I should wiki it. But Igor won a Soviet Union championship in '78, I think, or even '79. He tied for first, and then he also beat Anatoly Karpov in '79. So the point is, Igor was an up and comer, but he was only an international master. He wasn't even a grandmaster, right? But he was an up and comer and got an invitation to play in the Capablanca Memorial. And Igor told me this story, which later was documented by others. And at first, I didn't know how realistic it was. But he said he literally was going back to the plane after the event in Havana, Cuba, to get on the plane and go back to St. Petersburg. He was from Leningrad, and he literally physically ran for the embassy like border.
Oh,
and
wow.
The KGB chased him, and he literally like jumped over like the line, and the Soviet KGB agents couldn't pull him back.
Oh, wow.
And it's actually in his Wikipedia page that he defected, and it became very public because he got away from the Soviet Union.
Whoa.
With an aggressive and public defection. Later on, settled in Montreal, Canada, and Igor eventually lived in the States and played in a lot of tournaments and became kind of a well-known fixture of the American kind of like Grand Prix series. Actually, he played in events all over the U.S. But yeah, it was a very well publicized and documented defection of a top chess player from the Soviet Union.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah.
So realistic is what you're saying.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is I had to say, yeah, by the way, I wikied it while I finished my story. I didn't look at it, but I was right. Yeah, he beat Karpov in '79. He got an invitation to the Capablanca Memorial in 1980. And yes, that's when he defected.
Wow.
And literally, he got on the plane in Havana, but there was a stop in Montreal. That's right. And he defected while in Canada.
That's crazy.
And very famous story. So anyway, sorry, go ahead. I really wanted to add that because one, it's a very personal story for me. And Igor was someone who, both negative and positively, I mean, I've made jokes on shows where I say, I say something like, you made a blunder. Now, if I was my racist, Russian, abusive, alcoholic chess coach, this is what I would say to you. And when I say that, I'm not kidding. Igor was an overt racist. Igor was not the best human being. He wasn't. He was an alcoholic. He was a member of the Soviet Union. He was a Russian, but and Igor was also, I loved Igor and I knew Igor very well, and he left a positive impact on me because that's what I choose to focus on, not the negative impact stuff. But he was a very influential and well-known character of the United States, chess community, and he's one of the most publicly and well-documented defection stories ever from the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and that's the type of stuff we bring here on Blunders because
Hmm.
real life facts. I mean, it's really fascinating because I think you and I have been friends for decade plus or whatever, and there's actually a lot of your past that I don't know as much, and I continue to learn these things, and hopefully our listeners are fascinated by these stories because it's crazy to think about that those
Yeah.
things happen. Like, it's actually crazy to think in 2020, like going and traveling and learning and playing chess in Russia right now. Like, it's kind of mind boggling. I
I
was
mean, and
telling.
honestly, I've never told the story that direct, and there's more to it I could tell. I mean, I've told people some of the real, ugly stuff that I mean, my parents really left me alone with him way too much. I was making the man screwdrivers, vodka, orange juice at the age of 12 because they wanted me to get good, and I spent a lot of time with Igor. But anyway, so I've never told that full story, but yeah, Igor had a lot of stories for me, but that particular one was not exaggerated at all. He had a very real experience of physically jumping away from the KGB.
And make sure you subscribe to our new podcast, After Hours Chess with Danny
After
Rensch.
unlocking the mysteries and dysfunction of why Danny goes to therapy twice a month.
Now available on your favorite podcast app. Okay. So before we get into this match, there's a weird point in between where we know Borgov is going to open. Borgov is white. Mike and Matt, who like to show up randomly in this episode,
Yeah.
they like to say in the future,
Yeah.
Danny, when computers play chess,
Yeah,
that
I
white
love that.
will always win, just like in tic-tac-toe. And Danny, you have the computer chess championship and you
Yeah.
have these engines. There's no one better to talk about computer chess than Danny Rensch, I think, in 2020.
I well, I appreciate that. I don't know if that's totally true, but I do. Yeah, I'm probably one of the most qualified. And yeah, so our computer chess championship is running 24/7. It's almost like a project of love for my partner and our CEO Eric, who is fascinated by where the neural nets are taking our game. This podcast is going to be a lot longer than 90 minutes if we go down that road. So what I'll just say is, for those who didn't follow the emergence of AlphaZero from the Google DeepMind project, you have
Mm.
been under a rock. And neural nets, while chess has always been on the forefront of where computers are affecting humans, but I mean, some of the most infamous matches ever are Gary Kasparov, right? The Russian versus the IBM computer. People who don't even remember Kasparov's name will say things like, yeah, there was that match by the guy from Russia versus the IBM Deep Blue computer, remember?
Hmm.
Like, you've really made it when people can describe who you are without saying your name. Like, they say, who's that American who became world champion? They may not remember his name was Bobby Fischer, but they know of him, right?
Yeah.
So computers have always been very closely entwined with chess, but even more so in the last few years because of the jump into the world of what will eventually become Skynet and kill us all. And don't worry, I'll be your John Connor, baby. I'll be there for you. But eventually, we know Skynet's going to become self-aware and launch the missiles. And it'll probably be some version of AlphaZero, which was the chess computer launched by Google's DeepMind, which has now been taken and replicated by so many chess engine developers. There's so many hybrids now of what's called Leela, she's referred to as a girl, which is funny even though it's a computer, but Leela is in many ways the strongest chess engine right now, but her core is a combination, especially the hybrid versions of a neural network. So something humans gave minimal, like no influence over, and just let it teach itself chess, combined with sort of hybrid influence of the strongest chess engine technology, where we have taught the computers the right way to think about the game, right? Taught them how to make sacrifices where they give up the math, but to gain a greater mathematical edge in the end, which is ultimately like checkmate, right? So
Hmm.
I'll just say this. It's a fascinating thing. The people that are rabid in this community are seriously rabid. We basically just pay for these servers to have the top chess engines, neural nets and otherwise, battling it out all the time. And you can go there right now. Like, it's just streaming with no commentary on Twitch to somewhere between like a couple hundred to like 1,000 viewers just all the time. The chess.com/CCC is running nonstop. Computers are not winning when they're white. In fact, most games are drawn. To
Hmm.
go back to our Queen's Gambit episode that Mike and Matt referenced, most games are drawn, but it is true that you almost never see a victory with black. Like, you see a lot of draws, and then occasionally you see these brilliancies by these computers as white. You almost never see victories as black, but even that isn't true. It does happen on occasion, and so Mike and Matt, while they were right that white has the edge, they were wrong that it would be that clear. So
Yeah,
I'll say that.
and of course, in the real world, human versus human, they're not talking about engines and talking about computer chess. We see that obviously black, and Beth has won as black many a times here, right? So it's highly possible. But I mean, in your professional opinion, I mean, I have to imagine that yes, playing white is an advantage in a level of chess. Let's say you're not doing speed chess, right? Because I think it's different there too. Because it's faster play. There's probably some advantage there. But like in a world championship, what is the level of advantage to be white to start off? Is it astronomical? Is it negligible? Is it in
It's
between? What are we talking here?
it's about what you see in databases, which white wins in most mainline opening theory
Hmm.
about 56% of the time.
Mm,
So it's a small edge, right?
got it.
56, 57, somewhere between honestly 54 and 57% of the time. So you play 100 games, right? And you're going to get a lot of draws. White's going to have an edge a few games, right? And
Mhm.
and at the top levels of chess, those who followed the World Championship over the last few years, you know that in 2018 we had 12 straight draws between Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana, the American challenger, and the match was eventually decided in rapid because when the time controls get faster, people make more mistakes. They have less time to think their way through,
Mhm.
the dark forest that is chess, right?
Yeah.
So so at a high level, games amongst the top humans are very influenced by preparation
Mm,
of the top computers. I mean, I say this phrase often when I'm doing chess commentary that, hey, that game was won in the kitchen, right?
gotcha.
That game was won at home, right? That position was winning for Jan Nepomniachtchi of Russia before we even reached move 25. And it's
Mm,
very clearly that was home cooking. I like to use kitchen references, but people say it all the time, right? Like that game was won in the office, not at the board,
gotcha.
right?
Yeah.
And so, because top engines are used so heavily, the results are very similar to top engine on engine action, the PG kind, not rated X edition, computers gone wild. You know, meaning a lot of draws,
Yeah.
and every once in a while, someone out prepares or out ideas an opponent who maybe dismissed, like, oh, that's equal, but someone went a little further to reveal, no, this sacrifice actually in the end is really good for white, right? So it's a different type of chess than you were playing in the 60s, right? There was,
Mm,
intuition is still there and the best players in the world can still beat each other, but there's a lot of preparation done by the best players in the world are not human anymore, right? They're computers.
yeah.
And so they also heavily influence the top human players. And so you get results that are close to 50-50 with small edges for white.
Now, with these championships like this international, when it comes to the final match, would it be just one match and that's it? Because you were just talking about the Carlson match, right? Our good friend Magnus, like that's 7 matches. Is it more like the NBA, or like are a lot of the final tournaments like here's one and that's it, right?
Well, the so
Like
you're
how
asking like what's the
to
tournament format that decides the world champion kind of?
yeah, because wouldn't it be fair that hey, these are the best 2 players, so we're going to do best of 7 or whatever, best of
Right,
3,
right.
or is it just one match and like hey, no matter
No, no,
what,
no.
like this
Well,
is it?
it's one match, but a match is many games. So the typical world championship match, or let's say world championship cycle, which is actually running right now and was delayed due to the global pandemic that we all face, is you have a series of tournaments, usually 4 to 6, that are Grand Prix events, and people earn points. The
Hmm.
top point getters amongst the top players, the people who are in the top Grand Prix points, along with a few direct invitationals, like whoever the previous challenger was gets an automatic invite, maybe the local organizer of the candidates gives one wild card, but overall you get events with 8 players that is a double round robin. This is called the candidates, and the winner of the candidates challenges the current world champion. So
Hmm.
it's a Grand Prix system that describes the candidates. The candidates play a usually like a month-long event, which was postponed halfway through during COVID back in March. um, and then the candidates, which is set to resume this April in 2021, will decide the challenger to the world title. And then the world championship match will be a 12-game classical match.
Hmm.
If nobody has won after regulation, we will have a tiebreaker in rapid, which is what happened both the last 2 matches in 2018 and 2016.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. Now, so for this international Borgov v Harmon, is it realistic that there's just one match and that's it in this international style? tournament.
Yeah, no, this is realistic.
Okay.
It's not yeah, it's not this is an event that would be just what we would call a category 1 tournament, right? It's a bunch
Mm.
of the top world players there and a bunch of elite players. There's probably a decent prize fund and they're just playing each other. It's
Okay.
it's interesting. I think the chess cycle is it's kind of similar to tennis in that there's a lot of like major grand slams that don't necessarily decide who the world champion is. They're just big events, right? And the only difference is that tennis doesn't actually have that heavyweight boxing match that says, all right, now we've had all these. We know Djokovic and Federer are the best, and they're going to play a best of 7 over 2 weeks tennis, and we're going to see who the best is, right?
Mm.
Which, by the way, would be freaking badass. I mean,
Yeah.
that's kind of a cool thing. I think a lot of people have encouraged chess to go more the route of tennis and realize, look, you don't even need a world championship match. Just have major events running all the time. And whoever the number 1 is ranked tennis player in the world, that's just who everyone kind of knows is the best. But then people have said, no, actually, one of the things that's sexy about chess and has been proven is that regardless of where chess may need to grow, every couple of years you have that event that is like the heavyweight boxing Ali Frazier that everyone stops and goes, Morpheus is fighting Neo, right? And everyone comes and watches. And I think that tennis, you could argue, while you have Wimbledon and the Australian Open and the French Open, whatever, you could argue that all those things, maybe they also would benefit from like a single event every 2 years. That's like, now you get these 4 guys. We get Nadal, Djokovic, Federer, and, whoever together, right? Tsonga together, and they're going to throw down in this like month-long round robin, and that guy is the world tennis champion, right?
Gotcha.
I think people might like that. So anyway.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Borgov v. Harmon. Let's get into it. Let's talk about the opening here. This is a Rosalimo. No, this is a rare opening because we know that Borgov is a Sicilian master, basically. That's what they kind of tee him up as here. So this is a rare opening, the Rosalimo. Can you talk about this opening a little bit and how this sort of
the dialogue
pairs?
is a little awkward from our Spanish-speaking ajedrez, to say chess in Espanol. Our ajedrez, the broadcaster extraordinaire. It's a little awkward because he says, like, Borgov is the Sicilian master, and so now Beth Harmon plays pawn to queen's bishop 4, which is an attempt to like do something he doesn't know, which by the way is the Sicilian. So that I made very detailed notes of this. I was like, that's that's not totally accurate. Then he plays the Rosalimo with bishop to b5, but they actually don't define it as the Rosalimo until Beth plays queen to b6.
Yeah,
which is inaccurate. Borgov is the one who plays the Rosalimo, and Beth's post-game description to her mother laying in bed is actually more accurate than the real-time ajedrez commentary, in that she says, basically, he played this system that's not very known. I didn't know what to do about it, and then it was all like, systematic from there. He was a machine, right?
Yeah.
Her post-game depiction is very accurate, and we know that Borgov goes on to win this game, and that he did indeed dominate her Sicilian, and he did indeed play a system that she didn't know, and he obviously frustrated her, and she tells her mom, I'm glad you didn't get to see it, right? Because I didn't want you to be upset or whatever. So Beth's post-game depiction is perfect. The real-time one, I had to just point out those 2 inaccuracies. Like, you don't say that Beth did something to throw him off when she literally just played pawn to queen's bishop 4, which is the Sicilian. Yeah. And he only describes it as she plays the Rosalimo, which is inaccurate. He's the one who plays the Rosalimo with bishop b5, which, for the record, by the way, just funny coincidence, I didn't plan on this, but you and I just spent a bunch of time talking about Carlsen Caruana 2018. The Rosalimo was a regularly featured system in that 2018 World Chess Championship.
Oh, interesting.
It was played often, but at this time in the 60s, it's a very good depiction to say that it was kind of a sideline, not something she would know very well.
Gotcha. And then,
so they nailed it. Hashtag nailed it.
What's that thing that she says on that show?
Nailed it.
So we get to go to the end game here. We know that Beth's mom does not show up, even though Mike and Matt have saved the spot for her. We're at this end game that comes up in this fashion, and Beth it's not good. That bar, the analysis bar on the left-hand side is
+8 for white.
Plus 8.09 for white. Also, by the way, really quick, give the 10-second pinch of what that means in the real world, plus 809. I have no idea what that actually means.
It means white is completely winning.
Yeah.
I think that at the high levels, anything that goes beyond +3 very rarely goes back.
Mm.
Now at Blitz and Bullet, it does. I mean, if you watch the Speed Chess Championship, final between Nakamura and MVL, people do make blunders in Blitz and Bullet.
Mhm.
But at over the board chess, like never does an advantage from +3 not get converted to a win. Almost never among the world's elite. It's very rare. Something beyond +5, I would say almost like with 100% certainty, the top players win. The reason I would say even plus 1.5 to 3 is a significant advantage and most of the time converted. But there are times where the eval bar, or let's say the engine, just giving that mathematical evaluation of, hey, white's up +2 here, which is, by the way, a centapawn. Like, it's supposed to be like worth a pawn, even if it's not exactly a pawn on the board. That's just the computer's way of saying this guy's kind of like up 2 pawns in the position, the way that we've taught them to sort of spit out an evaluation for us to understand. It can be a little murky, even though I would say plus 1.5 to +3 is most of the time going to be 1, probably. It can slide back the other way because, there can often be enough complications that a human being is not going to play as perfect as an engine would and not convert on it. But, that's what that means, is white is winning.
Gotcha. So that white bar is very high. This is where we see Mr. Scheibel yet again. And Beth knows what to do. And she does what Garev did to her. And she forfeits. It's over. She
resigns.
She resigns. And she's not happy about it. And that's the end of the match, really. And I think that, we know by earlier dialogue that she will be in Paris. We know that Borgov will be in Paris. And
also from the first episode of the entire show.
Yes,
we know that.
We know that as well, right? And we know now, funnily enough, we were talking about Borgov, and I was like, remember that very first scene in the very first second? I was like, that was Borgov. And she's like, oh my God, right? Like it's finally come full circle where why that very opening scene in openings is very important, because we're at this sort of match in the future, which I'm excited about when we get there, which I don't know much about yet. But we get to the next scene here, which, is very sad in this regard, because there's two things that happen. Now, Danny, I don't know about you, but when you lose a chess match and you're very upset, do you go up to your room and start taking off all of your clothes?
Always.
Oh, okay.
I get butt naked.
Yep.
Butt naked.
Yep.
That was you made a comment early on in the episode that you felt that they unnecessarily sexualized Beth, and I assume this is exactly what you're referring to right here.
Yeah, this scene made no sense. Okay, we know that Beth's mom is up in the room. She like you said, she's doing this great job of describing the chess match. She is describing Borgov as this by the books. He shows no weakness. It's like he doesn't even have a soul in some way, just very stern on there. But at the same time, she's undressing. And we basically just see this 17-year-old at the time, like she's not naked, right? She has like this older school bra on, but back then there were more wires, and we see, for no reason, like I don't understand the context or the direction, but it felt to me very out of place and very unnecessarily sexualized for no reason. I just thought that it added zero value. In fact, it sort of made me rewatching it, especially, I was like, what is going on here? Like, what? I was like, why are they doing this? Because it kind of devalues, to me, the whole show in some way. Like, it was very unnecessary compared to the beginning, which we understand she's in this scenario with this boy, the schmuck, right? And that's fine. But it was just me. I just want to bring it up for context that there was no value add here besides to sexualize her for no reason.
I totally hear you, and I think that's totally fair. I'll push back for the sake of saying one point potentially, like I'm maybe reaching a little bit, but one like kind of subconscious point I think they're trying to imply, especially because we know that she ultimately finds her mother dead in the bed. And at this point, you've seen the episode, everyone, so don't get mad at me. And so what I wanted to say is that they're doing something there, which is like Beth feels safe with her mom and only her mom.
Yeah.
And I agree that one, it's Hollywood, it's movies, right? It's Anya Taylor-Joy. She's the lead female role in a movie where, I mean, I think that they're they're clearly doing something, like you said, that seems to devalue the show because they're over sexualizing a character
Mm-hmm.
purely because that's what you do in Hollywood, and you have an attractive female lead, and so you sexualize them, right? I mean, this is something that shows do. And I would say I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt because they don't ever go out of their way to show nudity in the show.
Yeah.
Like that is not something they do. And I'm sorry if I'm ruining spoilers for episodes, 5, 6, and 7, but they don't. And so because I know that they don't, like, I kind of looked at this as one, it was odd. I agree. And it definitely stood out to me watching the second time. But there's something that she's doing, like she's sort of like letting her guard down with her mom. She's like, it's not just sort of venting about how Borgov just destroyed her, but she's getting out of her uncomfortable clothes that she has to wear in this like male dominant world. She's just like stripping down and being real Beth and expressing herself in terms of how she feels vulnerable about how she just got, dominated by this guy. And then, like, twist ending, Beth Harmon's life is about to get even harder. We're in the midst of a real tragic 7-episode show. Everyone buckle up, because mom is dead in the bed and from alcohol, not necessarily, we'll say alcohol over an entire lifetime, right? Kind of.
Yeah.
And so that's all going to be my pushback. And I don't disagree with you. I found it slightly out of place, but I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt that maybe you don't have, because I already know that I don't find that this director and the writing ever went out of their way to add unnecessary, like, graphic nudity or sexuality. They clearly sexualize her, but it's also, the story of a woman coming into her age, and we see what happens with male characters later on in the show, which I won't spoil. But because I don't feel like they ever crossed the boundary, I kind of looked at this as like, she's just like pissed. She's like throwing off her clothes, and she's going to take a bath because she's got to relax, and she's going to vent with her mom and this and that. And that's somewhere who she feels so safe with. And then, oh my God, like, mom, what happened to you? Right. So that's my only pushback, but I do hear you.
And I definitely see it. I think that, again, it's hard to be, we're both white cis males, right? Talking on this podcast to the best of our analogy. While I am heavily involved in D&I exercises and heavily involved with conversations with people in my life, I can't, relate. But I can say this is, if it was the opposite in this, and this is me talking about movie and television and not, chess, which is what we like to do on this podcast, because I come from that background too, is like, listen, if Borgov had lost this match and we follow Borgov back into his room, is Borgov stripping down and looking at himself, and were we looking at him? We're not, by the way. So I think that's where if we flip it, it's there.
Yeah, I agree. I think you almost would have like been just like how movies can do a lot with one line of dialogue, like, come in, I'm so frustrated, I can't wait to take a shower.
Yeah.
Like, can you believe this happened? Right? Maybe if you say that, right, or something like that, like, it makes it like, all right, well, she was on her way to take a bath, right, or something.
You're missing context, right? You're missing context.
Exactly. And yeah. So anyway, so yeah, then let's, so she loses this game, she vents to her mom, and then the big ending of our episode is oh my God,
Mrs. Wheatley's gone.
Mrs. Wheatley's gone.
She's there still. It's heartbreaking in many aspects, not only to watch Beth go through this again, right? In this vein, she's lost 2 moms at this point. She's alone in Mexico, right? Mrs. Wheatley earlier says that she wasn't feeling well, that she had caught a virus. We find out that we believe it's hepatitis. And there's many forms of hepatitis, which is a virus of the liver, right? And you can get vaccinated. Many people are vaccinated against hepatitis now, but this can have an onset of alcohol as well, which we see this long-term thing here. So we believe that maybe that is the case. Poor Beth in this entire scene. We go through the hotels there to help her to get her on the plane. She gets a hold of Mr. Wheatley, the worst. I have it written down.
Mr. Wheatley is the worst.
Literally, what a schmuck. You know what I mean?
What a jerk. Right?
What a jerk. I mean, just absolutely the worst.
It's just, I'm not even, I don't want to foreshadow, but I'm sorry, buddy. It doesn't get any better.
Oh,
like, he's just not a good dude. Like, he's just a bad guy.
No.
He's a bad guy throughout the show.
So bad. But I do like the end part, which is she asked the doctor who's helping take her mom away. They're going to fly her back to Lexington, going to get her buried. Beth is going to get the house, or that's what Mr. Wheatley says. And she asked the doctor if she can get some, medication, basically some
greenies.
Some greenies. And the doctor said, Mexico, you don't need a prescription for that. Just go down to the office. And at the very end, we see her walk into the pharmacy. They give her the pill, and she says "mas," which is more in Spanish, right? And I'm excited for that because we now have an in as to Beth now knows that she can basically go to Mexico at any time and get as many tranquilizers as she wants. But yeah, that's by the way, at the very end scene on the plane back, she has Gibson's, which is
Yep.
and there's
a tribute.
a tribute to her mom with the empty seat next to her. So a send off to Mrs. Wheatley, a very sad episode. I literally texted you and I said, sad episode. Because not only did Beth lose, but lost again, right? So this middle game, which this middle episode could be actually tragic endgame.
Right.
Well,
what I said was, and I was going to save it for the end, but I already said earlier, is I think that's what this episode's about, is that there's more to life than chess, right? I mean, like everything from the beginning of what happens with her and her experiences to like how she talks to this kid, and then what happens with her that you don't see. I mean, I didn't see it coming when I watched it. And I was kind of upset. I was like, why didn't mom make it to Paris and whatever? Why did the writers do that? But then you realize, like, she had the experience with Manuel. It was like she, maybe she found some happiness she had never really found in her life with a healthy relationship with a guy that really loved her, right? And she had a great time in terms of experiences she certainly didn't get with Mr. Wheatley, Mr. Bad Guy, right? And so I kind of was like, and I liked it better the second time. The first time I was like, that was an odd way to write the mom out of the show. That was unnecessary. That was, and watching it, I was like, you know what? In the end of this episode, like the message is clear. Like Beth, her tragic life continues, her chess talent continues, but she's being shown like, look, welcome to the real world. This is a struggle. Borgov is not going anywhere, and there's more to life than just chess. Your mom wanted you to experience that. She was constantly pushing you to realize that, and now she's gone, right?
Yeah.
Which just is the ultimate sign up that there's more to life than chess, right? And I think, so again, knowing where the show go, I thought this was actually, it wasn't my favorite episode of all of them because it was sad and dark, but I don't feel like in the end it was bad. And knowing where the whole show goes, I really feel like it sets the tone for a back half that is going to be drama filled, full of obstacles to overcome for Beth Harmon. And we pay a tribute. By the way, I had Gibson's the other night with my buddy Dallin because we wanted to pay tribute to the Queen's Gambit and all new people learning chess. He's like, dude, let's make Gibson's. So we
Nice.
did. And by the way, they're gross. So onions do not go well with martinis. I prefer a traditional martini with olives. That's pretty much the only difference is a fermented sort of, soured onion versus an olive. And I prefer the traditional martini.
I'm going to try one. That's going to be next weekend. We're going to give it a go.
To Gibson's.
Well, we will get to that back half of the Queen's Gambit next week. That's right. We will come in on episode 5. We hope that you've enjoyed your journey along with us in this podcast. Of course, you can reach out to us anytime. Go to blunders.fm. You can leave comments on the show or just email us. There's a contact button. We also post these shows on YouTube. So you can also, it's there. So if you want to comment on YouTube and watch it there in the background, some people enjoy that much more. Or you can subscribe in your favorite podcast application. We are everywhere on Amazon, on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, on Overcast, on all the podcast applications. We, of course, would love a review. That helps more people find the podcast. The optimal way to help people find the podcast is just share it with them. Say, hey, check out this podcast.
Share with a friend.
We're literally sitting here remotely on Zoom discussing Queen's Gambit right now. Check out this podcast. And then boom, hopefully you can watch it back with us. I've enjoyed this so far. I'm excited to get into the back half of this series. Danny, thank you so much for breaking it down. I think that's going to do it for this week's Blunders. Anything else from you, buddy?
No, man, you did the thing, reminding everyone of all the things to follow and support. I can't wait for episodes 5, 6, and 7. I really am excited at this point. And yeah, we'll see you then next time.
Peace.